Have you ever reached a point in your life where the pain was so intense that you dared to ask God for something you never imagined asking? Something that seemed impossible to come out of your mouth, but that welled up from the depths of your soul because the wound was unbearable. I've reached it. My name is Margaret Johnson. I'm 62 years old, and today I'm going to open my heart like never before. For a long time, I carried a secret that consumed me inside, the feeling of having been betrayed. Not only by the man who promised to love me, but also by the silence of those around me, who preferred to judge rather than reach out. I was that devoted wife, always present, faithful to my family, and steadfast in my Christian faith. To everyone else, my marriage seemed solid, almost perfect. But within the walls of my home, the cracks grew silently. And when the truth finally came to light, when I discovered the cruel betrayal that had been hidden from me for so long, I felt as if the ground had disappeared from under my feet. Perhaps you've experienced something similar? Does this situation sound familiar? What struck me most was not just the betrayal, but the loneliness that followed. As I wept in secret, I heard whispers. She must not have been a good wife. Maybe she lacked prayer. It was as if, in addition to the pain of abandonment, I also had to bear the weight of judgment. And worse, they asked me to remain silent, to not expose the truth, as if my pain were too inconvenient to be heard. Brace yourself. What comes next will shock you. There were nights when I knelt and begged God for something terrible. I said, "Lord, take him, because I can't bear to live with this shame, this humiliation, this wound that kills me every day." And I confess, it scares me to this day, because when pain pierces the soul, we think things we never would have imagined. Don't leave now. The best is yet to come. And it was in this dark abyss, between tears and stifled prayers, that I began to realize something that would change everything. There were days when I prayed, asking God to take the man I swore to love until the end of my life. This sentence may seem harsh, almost impossible to believe, but it arose from an open wound, from the pain of seeing myself betrayed by the one who promised to walk beside me through every season of life. When I discovered the truth, I felt like my entire world had been dismantled before my eyes. Every word, every gesture, every memory of the past now seemed like a well-rehearsed lie. And in the silence of my soul, I began to question whether all the effort, so many nights awake in prayer, so many decisions I'd made believing I was building a solid family, had really been worth it. It's strange how the human mind reacts to shock. First comes denial. This can't be happening to me. Then comes anger. How could he do this, after everything we've been through? And then emptiness, a deep hole that saps strength and saps the color from our days. It was in this emptiness that I, a Christian woman, began to think things I never thought I would. I asked God to take him, not because I desired his death, but because I could no longer bear the impact of that reality. It was a cry of despair, a plea for relief, for deliverance. At that time, I realized that betrayal doesn't just destroy a marriage. It shakes identity, dismantles the mind, and weakens faith. I saw myself as a shadow of my former self, unsure if I still had the strength to start over. It was as if everything around me had lost meaning, and life had become a dark corridor with no exit. But through tears and sleepless nights, I began to realize that behind this pain, there was also a hidden opportunity, a hidden truth, only revealed when we are broken inside. It was then that I began to look behind the scenes of my own life. Who was I really? Where was I placing my worth? The betrayal exposed not only his infidelity, but also my emotional dependence, how much I had erased myself in the name of a relationship. This revelation frightened me as much as the betrayal itself. I realized that at many moments I had stopped being Margaret and was simply his wife. And when he left me, what was left of me? This journey has been marked by pain, but also by transformation. I've learned that even amidst chaos, it's possible to see paths to healing. But there's something even more essential here, something few realize. This is my story of betrayal, abandonment, and faith, told to you who may be going through something similar. I never imagined that at 62 I would be opening up about my life this way, but I understood that keeping everything silent only increases the pain. Often, what destroys me is not just the act of betrayal itself, but the isolation that follows, as if shame forces us to wear a mask and pretend nothing happened. That's exactly how I felt. A woman shattered inside, but forced to appear strong in front of others. Behind the scenes, the reality was different. Sleepless nights, tears stifled in my pillow, and a feeling of failure that accompanied me constantly. It's curious how the mind creates stories to try to justify what has no explanation. I spent days wondering where I went wrong, what decisions I made in the past could have changed the course of things. It was as if I relived every detail of the wedding, searching for clues I hadn't seen, signs that were there but that my blind faith had prevented me from seeing. This relentless search for the cause of my suffering consumed me, but it was also the starting point for something I hadn't expected, a transformation in my mindset. I realized that the impact of that pain was pushing me on a new journey, where I would have to rediscover myself. There were moments when I found myself remembering his small actions, his distant glances, his automatic gestures, and it was as if an entire film played before my eyes, revealing the hidden truth I'd denied for years. The abandonment didn't begin when he left home. It had begun long before, in details I'd ignored, believing love and faith would be enough to sustain everything. This revelation was painful, but necessary. Understanding that I had remained silent in the face of so many small deaths within the marriage was a greater shock than the ultimate betrayal itself. It was at this point that I began to see myself differently, not just as the betrayed wife, but as a woman who would need to make different choices from then on. I needed to reclaim my voice, rebuild my identity, and stop accepting the supporting role in my own story. That's when I realized that, despite the chaos, there was a hidden strength within me, waiting to be awakened. A strength that would guide me down paths I never would have imagined I'd take alone. And it was precisely at this point in my journey that a new understanding began to dawn, bringing with it not only pain, but also possibilities that until then, I had not dared to believe were real. I was the devoted wife, the woman who did everything for the house, the children, and the church. My life revolved around serving, caring, and always being available to anyone who needed me. I learned early on that a good Christian wife should be patient, understanding, and willing to carry burdens in silence, and I believed this with all my heart. My routine was marked by small gestures of dedication, getting up early to make coffee, praying for the family before bed, being present in every detail that kept the home in order. For many, this was proof of virtue. For me, it was simply the natural way of life. Behind the scenes, however, there was a weight I wouldn't even admit to myself. I gradually eroded myself. Every decision revolved around what he wanted, what was best to maintain the appearance of harmony. If I had my own desires, I learned to swallow them. If something hurt me, I kept quiet, believing that was the cross I had to bear. This pattern repeated itself for years, and the impact was devastating because I stopped seeing myself as an individual. I became an extension of his life, someone who existed only to meet his expectations. Over time, I realized that this attitude had shaped my mindset in a dangerous way. I believed that being submissive meant giving up my voice, when in reality, submission should never have been synonymous with self-denial. The hidden truth is that I hid behind faith to avoid facing my own needs. And this made me believe that happiness lay only in keeping up appearances, in being seen as the woman who never complained, the model wife. This construct imprisoned me to such an extent that, when the betrayal came to light, I no longer knew who I was. I remember a conversation where someone said to me, "Margaret, you've always been so strong, so firm in everything." I smiled on the outside, but on the inside, I almost laughed at myself. Strong? I felt shattered, directionless, living a role that no longer made sense. It was like watching my own life from the outside, seeing the revelations unfold before my eyes, but lacking the courage to face them head on. This identity shock was perhaps as painful as the abandonment, because it forced me to face decisions I'd been avoiding for years. The journey thus far has been marked by sacrifices I myself chose, believing they were the right thing to do. But when reality showed me how far I had lost myself, a new awareness began to dawn. and with it, a silent call to reclaim who I truly was. This discovery of who I truly was brought me a mixture of pain and relief. Pain, because I realized how much I had lost myself over the years. Relief, because I was finally able to see the root of so many wounds I had silently carried. It wasn't easy to admit that I had allowed myself to be erased to fit into a role I had always been taught. But it was in this internal confrontation that something began to shift within me, as if God were showing me that my story didn't have to end marked only by abandonment and betrayal, but could transform into a testament to strength and renewal. And it's precisely at this point that I want to open my heart to you, listening now. If my words are somehow touching your soul, if this journey of revelations awakens something in you, I ask you, like this video. It may seem like a small, almost insignificant gesture, but the truth is that each like helps this message reach more women who may be living in silence and need to hear that they are not alone. Your participation here is what makes this channel grow and reach more people with this kind of content. It's as if each click is a way of saying, I understand this pain too, and I want others to find hope. If this topic resonates with you, leave a comment below with what resonated most with you, because your story might be just the answer another woman needs to stay strong. This support network, even through a screen, has a profound impact. Together, we can transform isolation into communion, silence into voice, and pain into learning. And it was in this spirit of community that I began to look at my own story not just as a personal tragedy, but as part of a larger journey, where each fall revealed something new about me, something I needed to rescue in order to move forward. In everyone's eyes, we had the perfect marriage, but only I knew the hidden cracks. It was curious to observe how people looked to us as role models, as if we were living proof that a Christian home could weather any storm. I smiled in photos, held her hand in church, and maintained the posture of an exemplary wife. But deep down, I felt like each day the walls of our home hid more secrets, more distances, more heavy silences. The impact this had on my life was profound, because while everyone else saw a success story, I carried the weight of a narrative that didn't match reality. What no one noticed were the interrupted conversations, the frequent absences, the excuses I no longer even questioned. Small details that, in isolation, might seem trivial, but together formed a painful picture of emotional abandonment. I constantly asked myself, is this really what God planned for me? And at the same time, I felt guilty for even considering questioning it. After all, the image we'd built in public seemed unshakable. This internal conflict consumed me, as if I were living behind the scenes of a play, playing a role that was no longer mine. It's amazing how mindsets are shaped by circumstances. I convinced myself that enduring in silence was a test of faith, when in reality, I was merely postponing facing the hidden truth. The revelations emerged little by little, in cold looks, in absences disguised as commitments, in conversations that ended before they even began. I found myself faced with a dilemma: continue to uphold an image or accept reality and deal with the consequences. This decision seemed impossible because it involved not only my heart, but also my family's faith, the church's opinion, and even the judgment of people I barely knew. On the outside, the marriage was solid. On the inside, it was a sandcastle about to crumble. Every day I felt the sand slipping through my fingers, but I tried to build even higher walls so no one would notice. The impact on my emotional health was devastating. I felt exhausted, as if I were living a double life, the life I portrayed and the life that truly existed. It was a weight I no longer had the strength to carry alone, but which, out of fear and shame, I continued to harbor in silence. And it was in this silence that a wound began to grow almost invisibly, until the moment when it would no longer be possible to hide it. One day, I realized he no longer looked at me the same way. It seems small, almost insignificant, but for those who have lived side by side for years, a look can reveal truths that words hide. Before, there was affection, admiration, and even pride in his eyes when he spoke to me. But suddenly, everything seemed distant, cold, as if I had ceased to be an essential part of his life, and had become just another detail in the scenery. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just fatigue, that maybe it was just a difficult phase at work or some worry he didn't want to share. Deep down, I already knew something was wrong, but I chose to deceive myself for fear of what I would discover if I faced that change head on. These first signs always come subtly. A kiss that once felt natural now felt rushed. A conversation that once lasted hours was interrupted by awkward silences. I found myself trying to make conversation, asking about his day, but receiving short, almost automatic answers. It was as if, little by little, I was talking to a stranger in my own home. This impact began to erode my heart, because I didn't want to accept the possibility that love was fading before my eyes. The journey of someone who discovers an affair never begins with complete revelation, but with small clues we insist on ignoring. And I, having grown accustomed to believing that marriage was forever, closed my eyes to the revelations that lay before me. It wasn't a lack of intelligence, it was an excess of hope. I wanted to believe there was still room for transformation, that a simple gesture of mine could reignite something that was clearly already fading. Behind the scenes, however, the hidden truth was already manifesting itself in details I could no longer hide from myself. The absence from family meals, the excuse of being overworked, the cell phone always face down on the table. Small actions that carried within them a huge burden of silent decisions he had already made without telling me. This process was like a constant dripping in my mind, shaping my mindset into a state of alert mixed with denial. And the more I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, the more the emptiness grew. The psychological impact was profound because I realized I was trapped in a cycle of questioning. Did he still love me? Was the problem with me? This relentless search for answers consumed me, even as I clung with all my strength to the faith that sustained me. Until one day, the silence and the averted glances could no longer be ignored because something even more obvious happened, bringing to light what I feared so much. When I discovered the betrayal, I felt as if my heart had been ripped from my chest. It wasn't just the confirmation of a suspicion, it was the collapse of an entire world I'd believed to be solid. It was as if, suddenly, every detail of my life up until that point had been placed in a new light, and what I'd seen as love and commitment had revealed itself to be nothing more than an illusion sustained by appearances. The impact was so devastating that for a moment, I even lost track of who I was. It wasn't just about losing a husband, but about losing trust in everything I'd built. The scene of that revelation was etched in my memory like a wound that never fully heals. I remember his trembling hands, the suffocating silence that filled the room, his gaze that couldn't quite meet mine. It was as if, in that instant, time had stopped to show me the hidden truth I'd avoided facing for so long. His every word felt like a blade, cutting not only my dignity, but also my history. I wondered, how could someone who shared so many years of his life with me, who walked beside me through so many decisions, betray me so coldly? The most painful part wasn't just learning about the other person, but realizing that all that time I'd been living behind the scenes of a lie. He was no longer with me long before he confessed. His body was there, but his mind, heart, emotions, everything had already departed. This revelation made me revisit every memory and realize that the pieces no longer fit together, that the signs were there, glaring, and that I, for fear of losing what I believed to be indestructible, refused to see. Betrayal not only destroys trust in others, it also dismantles self-confidence. I began to doubt my own ability to perceive reality, to evaluate people, to make decisions. The mindset that had once been sustained by faith and love was now weakened, mired in insecurity and shame. I looked in the mirror and didn't recognize the woman reflected there. It was as if I had lost not only my partner, but also the version of myself that I believed was enough. This journey through grief made me realize how much betrayal has an impact that goes far beyond marital breakdown. It corrodes identity, undermines self-esteem, and leaves invisible scars that bleed silently. But at the same time, in that void where there seemed no escape, something began to stir within me, a restlessness I couldn't name. It was as if life was pushing me toward a new understanding. even if I didn't yet have the strength to accept it. I asked myself, God, why me? I've served you my entire life. That was the first prayer that came out of my mouth after the discovery. It was as if my entire spiritual world had been shaken at once. I couldn't understand how a God of love, whom I had followed so devotedly, could allow me to be struck by such cruel pain. For years, my life had been marked by service. I was always ready in church, helping, counseling other women, holding the hand of those crossing the desert. And suddenly, I found myself drowning in my own desert, with no one to hold my hand. I felt abandoned, not only by my husband, but also by heaven itself. I spent sleepless nights questioning every detail of my journey. I remembered all the times I interceded for my family, the times I bent my knees asking for protection for my home. And yet, evil had entered precisely where I believed it was most sheltered. This plunged me into a spiritual crisis that seemed endless. When I opened the Bible, the words seemed distant, cold, unable to reach the bleeding wound within me. I wondered if I still had faith, or if everything I had experienced up until that point was just a religious routine crumbling before the first great storm. The hidden truth no one talks about is that betrayal not only destroys trust in a relationship, but also shakes the foundations of faith. I felt deceived for believing that obedience and fidelity would guarantee a life protected from such profound pain. And this revelation brought me a sense of spiritual failure, as if I had failed to live up to God's expectations. Behind the scenes, the struggle was even more intense, smiling at others at church while simultaneously screaming silently at home, wondering if God truly heard me. This impact was transformative because it forced me to rethink my approach to spiritual life. I realized that for a long time I had associated faith with the absence of suffering, when in reality, faith is tested precisely in the midst of it. It was a shock to understand this, because until then, my journey seemed based on rewards, on believing that every right decision would protect me from tragedy. But now, I was faced with a painful truth. Being faithful doesn't free us from the journey's most cruel pains. And it was at that point that my prayers changed tone. They ceased to be just a desperate plea of, why me, and became a search for meaning, for an answer that would make sense of the chaos I was experiencing. I still didn't have all the answers, but something began to dawn within me, as if a new understanding were about to unfold. As I wept silently, I heard from many, maybe you weren't enough of a wife. These words cut deeper than any cold stare or dismissive gesture I received from him. It was as if, in addition to the pain of being betrayed, I had to carry the weight of the guilt that others insisted on placing on my shoulders. Society, and often even the faith community itself, has a cruel way of turning the victim into the guilty party. Suddenly, it wasn't enough to face the emptiness of abandonment. I also had to deal with the voices pointing fingers at me, telling me that if he left me, the fault could only be mine. Behind the scenes at church, where I had so often been a source of support and comfort to other women, I began to feel judgmental stares. It wasn't necessary for them to say anything directly. The uncomfortable silence, the diversion of conversation, the way some avoided the subject, as if my pain were contagious, was enough. And when the words came, they were even harsher. You should pray more. Maybe you weren't submissive enough. A home doesn't fall apart without both parties being at fault. Each such phrase was like salt thrown into an open wound, a cruel reminder that besides losing a husband, I was also losing the respected place I had among those I considered my spiritual family. This experience made me realize a hidden truth. Many people prefer to believe that the betrayed woman is responsible for the failure of the marriage because it makes them feel safe in their own homes. It's as if, by placing the blame on me, they can believe that if they do everything right, they'll never go through the same thing. But the reality is different. Betrayal is a choice, a decision made deep down, and nothing justifies breaking a vow that should be sacred. This revelation brought me clarity, but also a huge burden, because I found myself faced with the challenge of rebuilding myself without the support I expected. The psychological impact of this judgment was almost as devastating as the betrayal itself. I felt invisible and exposed at the same time, as if my life had become a stage where everyone could point out mistakes I never made. This alien mindset tried to imprison me, but something inside me resisted, a voice insisting that I could not allow the gaze of others to define who I was. And it was in this internal confrontation between what they said about me and what I knew God said about me that a new strength began to emerge, still fragile, but enough to keep me standing in the face of so many revelations. At church, they asked me to be discreet, to not talk about what had happened. The justification was to protect the testimony, preserve the family's image, and avoid scandal. But deep down, this request sounded like an order for me to swallow my pain and keep smiling, as if nothing had changed. The impact of this was devastating, because in addition to facing betrayal and judgment, I now had to deal with the weight of imposed silence. It was as if my voice had been ripped from me, as if my suffering were too inconvenient to be exposed. Behind the scenes, that demand revealed something few have the courage to admit. Appearances are often worth more than the truth. The fear of tarnishing the church's or leadership's reputation seemed greater than concern for the wounded soul of a woman who simply needed to be heard. And I, already fragile, ended up giving in. I held back tears in silence during services, greeted people with a broken heart, and attended meetings trying to disguise the feeling that no one really wanted to know what was happening to me. This kind of collective decision has a profound impact because it transforms the victim into an accomplice to a socially acceptable lie. The hidden truth is that this silence protects no one. It only prolongs the pain. Each time I was asked to keep quiet, I felt like I was being nullified again, reliving the same pattern of blind submission that had already imprisoned me within my marriage. It was as if they were telling me, be strong, but don't speak. Grieve, but in secret. Cry, but behind closed doors. This mentality made me question the extent to which the concept of community truly existed, because when I needed support most, I found only walls and averted eyes. It was in this context that I realized a stark revelation. Often, the faith we profess is used to cover up human frailties rather than heal them. Silence wasn't just about betrayal. It was about trying to maintain a flawless narrative, even at the cost of my dignity. And the more I accepted silence, the more the void grew, transforming my faith journey into a territory marked by contradictions. But even in this suffocating silence, something began to stir within me. I knew I couldn't remain silent forever, that there was a part of me crying out to be rescued, a voice that needed to break through the walls of shame. And it was in this internal conflict that I began to notice signs of a transformation that would completely change the way I saw my own story. On nights of pain, I prayed, Lord, take him, because I can't bear to live with this shame anymore. That phrase came from within me like a stifled cry, a mixture of despair, anger, and helplessness. I clearly remember how the silence of the early morning seemed to amplify my tears, and how my prayers, once full of hope and confidence, now turned into desperate cries for relief. It wasn't that I wished for his death per se, but for the death of the suffering he caused me. I wanted somehow for that story to have an end, for that pain to have a final point, because living like that, with my soul crushed, was like being condemned to a prison without bars. It was during this period that I realized how pain can distort even our most intimate prayers. The mindset I'd always carried of unshakable faith and trust in the divine plan was completely shaken. I no longer prayed for restoration. I prayed for disappearance. And this frightened me deeply because it felt like I was becoming someone I no longer recognized. Behind the scenes of my life, a war was raging. On one side, the faith that said God was love and justice. On the other, the pain that made me believe I had been forgotten by him. This journey was marked by endless nights, during which I struggled for words, but only sobs came out. The impact on my mind was profound because I began to believe that perhaps my entire life had been built on illusions. I wondered if the dedicated woman who served, prayed, and believed had been merely a figurehead, while the real Margaret was buried beneath layers of silence and disappointment. Each desperate prayer revealed a little more of the hidden truth. I wasn't just asking God to take him. I was also asking him to take the part of me that no longer knew how to continue existing. As the days passed, I realized that these words weren't just the result of hatred or hurt, but of exhaustion. I was tired of being strong, tired of maintaining a facade, tired of believing that all it took was endurance for everything to make sense. The betrayal had left a void so great that not even faith, at first, seemed capable of filling it. But paradoxically, it was within this void that a new revelation began to form, like a seed germinating amidst the darkness. And although I still didn't have the strength to understand what was being born there, I realized that my prayers, even the most desperate ones, were opening space for something that would radically change the way I saw myself and my journey. Suddenly, I found myself alone, without a husband, without support, and even without a voice. It was as if the ground had opened up and I had fallen into an empty space where the silence was deafening. The house, which had once seemed full of life, became a cold place, marked by memories that now hurt, more than they comforted. The space he occupied at the table, the clothes left in the closet, the perfume that still lingered in the air, all became triggers for a pain that seemed endless. But what shook me most wasn't the physical absence. It was the feeling that I had lost my place in the world, as if I suddenly no longer had an identity. The isolation was cruel because it wasn't just about being without company. It was the weight of knowing that many around me saw me as someone marked by failure, as if I were living proof that not all stories end well. This collective mentality made me withdraw even further. Behind the scenes of my routine, I hid tears during the day and, at night, wondered if anyone really cared. The loneliness wasn't just geographic, it was emotional, spiritual, and psychological. And it was in this emptiness that I realized the profound impact that abandonment causes. It's not just losing someone, it's also losing a part of yourself that seemed to exist only in the relationship. This lonely journey forced me to confront a hidden truth I'd never wanted to face. I'd placed my entire identity in the role of wife. Without that role, who was I? This question lingered in my mind every day. The answer didn't come easily, because it required a process of transformation, of internal reconstruction, which I still didn't know where to begin. It was painful to admit that I hadn't made room to be just Margaret, because for years I'd lived to be his woman. And, at the same time, a silent revelation was dawning within me. The loneliness, though overwhelming, began to reveal another side, the opportunity to find myself. It was as if, in the middle of the desert, I was discovering small signs of life that insisted on flourishing. Still fragile, still confused, but enough to make me believe that perhaps this period of emptiness had a greater purpose. It was in this contrast between pain and revelations that a new consciousness began to emerge, leading me to unexpected decisions and a journey of self-discovery that I never imagined I would embark on. This profound loneliness made me understand that at certain moments in life, what we need most is simply to be heard. It was in this silence that I realized how many other women, like me, may be experiencing similar situations, carrying hidden pain, fears they dare not reveal, and feelings that seem too heavy to put into words. And that's why I want to open a space of welcome here. If this topic resonates with you, leave a comment below with what touched you most, or even a bit of your own story. Sometimes the simple act of sharing is the first step toward healing, not only for the writer, but also for those who read and relate. Your participation here is what makes this channel grow and reach more people with this kind of content. Every comment, every like, every subscription is like a seed planted, allowing this message to reach other women who may be crying in silence today, believing no one understands their pain. Together, we can transform this space into a supportive community, a place where vulnerability isn't seen as weakness, but as the courage to expose yourself and allow yourself to start over. And it was in this movement of opening my heart and realizing that other voices also echo the same pains that I began to understand that my journey, however hard it had been, could gain a new meaning. I came to believe I was nothing more than the betrayed wife. This label stuck to me like an invisible mark, and no matter how hard I tried to hide it, it was as if my entire being was defined by this pain. I no longer saw myself as a mother, a daughter, a friend, or even a woman. It was as if the betrayal had swallowed up all other versions of me and left only that shadow, heavy and suffocating. When I looked in the mirror, I didn't see the Margaret who once dreamed, who once smiled, who believed in the future. I saw only someone broken, someone who had been replaced and discarded. This process of identity loss is devastating because it doesn't happen overnight. It's a silent journey where each memory reinforces the feeling of not being enough. I compared myself to the other woman, trying to guess which qualities she had that I no longer had. This cruel exercise consumed me inside and fueled the lie that I was no longer worthy. In the back rooms of my mind, the voice of rejection is loud, tirelessly repeating that you are unwanted, unloved, and left because you weren't good enough. The impact this had on my mindset was profound. I began to doubt not just my beauty or my role as a wife, but my very essence. Who was I without that marriage? Who was I without that life that for so many years defined my days? It's frightening to realize how much we can lose when we place our identity in something or someone that can be taken away from us in an instant. This revelation was harsh, but necessary, because it exposed the hidden truth I'd tried to deny. I had failed to cultivate myself and had become hostage to a role that wasn't eternal. At that moment, my journey took on a new perspective. I was still immersed in pain, but within it arose the possibility of transformation. Perhaps that loss of identity was, in fact, a call to rediscover who I truly was, without labels, without masks, without depending on external validation. And although this awareness was still fragile, it began to illuminate small glimmers in the darkness, indicating that there was more to be experienced, more to be revealed, more to be rescued within me. It was in my despair that I realized I was placing my value in the wrong man. This revelation didn't come as a sudden flash, but as a slow process, built on tears, sleepless nights, and seemingly unanswerable questions. I had made him the center of my life, the axis that supported my identity, and when that axis broke, everything inside me crumbled with it. It was painful to face this hidden truth, because it meant admitting that I myself had contributed to the prison I was in, not by betraying him, which was his choice, but by giving so much of myself away that I no longer knew who I was without that marriage. This realization was like a mirror held before me, reflecting an image I didn't want to see. I realized that the decisions I made, the dreams I set aside, even the silences I accepted, were deeply rooted in the desire to be recognized by him. The validation I sought always came from his gaze, and when that gaze shifted, I felt everything lost its meaning. The journey of realizing this was painful, but also necessary, because it is only in confronting our own distortions that the possibility of transformation arises. The impact of this realization was profound. Suddenly, I began to realize that my faith, though sincere, had often been used as a justification to nullify myself. I told myself I was serving God, but deep down, I was hiding behind a misinterpreted obedience, a mindset that confused love with absolute submission. Behind the scenes, this false belief kept me trapped in a cycle of silence and pain, and I had to face the fact that continuing to feed it would perpetuate my own destruction. This revelation didn't bring immediate relief. On the contrary, it exposed me to even greater vulnerability, because understanding that I placed my value in someone who didn't know how to honor me meant rebuilding everything from scratch. And this reconstruction requires courage, firm decisions, and the choice to look within instead of seeking outside. I didn't have all the answers, but I began to feel within me a seed of strength, small, almost imperceptible, but real. A strength that told me that maybe, just maybe, I could rediscover my essence away from what imprisoned me. And it was at this point, in the midst of this conflict between pain and revelations, that a new stage of my journey began to form, bringing even deeper questions and a hope that I did not expect to find. One day, in prayer, I heard a voice within me so clear it left no room for doubt. "My daughter, you are loved, even when rejected by men." That phrase penetrated my heart as if it had cut through all the layers of pain accumulated over time. It wasn't just a sense of comfort. It was a spiritual reality check, a revelation that brought light to the darkest corners of my soul. I was so accustomed to measuring my worth by how I was perceived, so conditioned to expect external validation, that hearing this truth so intimately and directly stopped me. It was as if God had interrupted my spiral of self-destruction to remind me of something I already knew but had buried beneath so much hurt. In that moment, I realized that the entire narrative I'd been feeding about being the betrayed, rejected, discarded woman wasn't the truth about me. It was only part of the story, not the final definition of my identity. The divine answer revealed that, behind the circumstances, there was a value that couldn't be erased by human decisions, by other people's mistakes, or even by my own fragility. This realization had an immediate impact. Tears flowed, no longer of despair, but of relief, of someone who finds a thread of hope in the midst of a labyrinth. And at the same time, this inner voice challenged me, because being loved by God also meant taking responsibility for how I saw myself. I could no longer continue to harbor that defeatist mentality, no longer accept the shadows of a life that diminished me. The hidden truth that emerged was simple yet powerful. I needed to decide to believe what He said about me, more than the scars left by rejection. This didn't erase the pain, but it gave me the strength to move through it. Little by little, I began to understand that that answer wasn't just a momentary relief, but an invitation to profound transformation. It was as if God were opening a new page in my journey, showing me that there was life after loss, that there was identity after rejection. Each word echoed within me as a reminder that the impact of one decision doesn't define the destiny of an entire life. And as I let this truth take root, I realized that something greater was being silently built, preparing the ground for steps I hadn't yet dared to imagine, but which were already beginning to emerge within me. I began to stand, slowly, tears still streaming, but now faith sustained each step. It was a strange sensation, because on the outside, almost nothing had changed. The loneliness was still there, the memories still hurt, the scars remained raw, but inside, something was beginning to stir, like a small flame that insisted on lighting even in the midst of the wind. This silent force drove me to no longer accept living as a spectator of my own story. I understood that the transformation wouldn't happen all at once, that it wouldn't be like turning a key and forgetting everything that had happened, but rather like rebuilding a house after a storm, brick by brick, detail by detail, with patience and courage to start over. It was during this process that I realized how mindset directly influences the course of our journey. Previously, my mind was trapped in narratives of failure and rejection, and I kept telling myself that I was worthless, that there was no way out, that my identity was broken. But by allowing the divine answer I had received to resonate within me, I realized that change needed to begin precisely where the inner voices screamed loudest. It was there, in the shadows of my emotions and thoughts, that I needed to make new decisions, however small, however imperfect. And it's curious how, when we take the first step, however shaky, something in the universe seems to align. Revelations began to emerge in unexpected ways. Sometimes it was a word I read by chance, a seemingly ordinary encounter, or even a silence that made me reflect on who I wanted to be from then on. These weren't coincidences. They were constant reminders that I wasn't alone, that there was a real impact in every choice, no matter how small. With each gesture, with each attempt, I proved to myself that I wasn't just the rejected wife, but a woman rebuilding, someone who could choose to see beauty even in the ruins. This reconstruction wasn't just about overcoming personal pain, but about discovering a new way of living. I began to see life as an opportunity to write different chapters, to experience the hidden truth we so often ignore. We are not defined by what happened to us, but by what we choose to do with it. And it was precisely at that point that I understood that my faith wasn't an escape from reality, but an invitation to see it from a different perspective. Rejection was no longer a sentence, but rather the fertile ground where I could blossom in a new way. Each tear that fell as I took those first steps seemed to water the earth of my own transformation. And even though the future remained uncertain, there was one certainty that guided me. I no longer needed to live in the shadow of what had hurt me. Little by little, A new version of me was emerging, stronger, more aware, more whole. And as I progressed, I understood that this journey wasn't just about recovering what I had lost, but about building something I never imagined could exist. I discovered, in this process of rebuilding, that there is a hidden truth that completely changes the way we see life. God doesn't take people away because we ask Him to, but He is capable of taking the pain from within us, if we have the courage to let go. This revelation was like a turning point within me. I understood that my struggle wasn't against the absence of the other, but against the weight I carried by insisting on keeping wounds open. It was like realizing that all that time I had been holding on to thorns tightly, believing that without them I would have nothing. But the reality was different. All it took was letting go for healing to begin to manifest. This learning didn't happen overnight. It was the result of small acts of surrender, of daily decisions not to harbor resentment, of choosing to look forward even when everything inside me wanted to return to the past. It's curious how, when we begin to change our mindset, the impact is visible even in the simplest things. I realized the pain was still there, but it no longer dominated me in the same way. Sadness came, but it didn't stay forever. It was as if each tear that once weighed me down had now transformed into seeds of hope, irrigating new ground within me. And perhaps this is one of the most difficult parts of the entire journey. Accepting that we don't have control over other people's choices, but we do have the power to decide what to do with what happened to us. It was at this point that I realized how my prayers were changing. Before, I'd asked God to remove people, situations, and memories. Now, I simply opened myself up to Him to teach me how to let go of what no longer fit in my life. And in this movement, I discovered something liberating. It's not what we lose that defines us, but the strength we find in the midst of loss. Transformation, then, ceased to be just a distant dream and began to become a present reality. I understood that there was still a long road ahead, full of revelations and decisions that would require courage, but I no longer felt the same. There was a new awareness, a silent certainty that even when everything seems to be falling apart, there is a greater purpose behind every pain. This learning showed me that life isn't about having all the answers, but about trusting the process, allowing the impact of experiences to shape us in ways we perhaps never imagined. And as I walked, this understanding became increasingly clear. It wasn't about forgetting what happened, but about learning to live differently, more lightly, more consciously, more connected to what truly matters. Because deep down, when we choose to let go, we make room to receive something that was waiting for us all along. It was at this point that something inside me began to shift. I no longer saw myself simply as someone wounded by the past, carrying the scars of rejection like an endless sentence. Gradually, I began to realize that this identity of eternal victim didn't belong to me, that I had clung to a narrative that was never the one God had written for me. There was a hidden truth that now made sense. I was not defined by betrayal, nor abandonment, nor another person's choices. I was, and always had been, a beloved daughter of a Father who sustains me. And this revelation changed absolutely everything. It was as if, suddenly, the lens through which I viewed my own life had been replaced. What had once been mere pain now had a purpose. What once seemed like an end now became a beginning. It was like walking down a dark hallway and noticing, at the end, a small light that gradually became so intense that it compelled me to walk toward it. And in this movement, each step was charged with meaning, as if each tear were also a key, opening doors that had previously been locked by grief. This repositioning wasn't just emotional, it was also mental. I needed to shift my mindset, to redefine the voices I chose to listen to. For a long time, I had given more space to internal accusations, those that told me I wasn't enough, that I would never be able to rebuild anything, that what was lost could never be restored. But when the truth began to settle within me, I realized these voices were nothing more than echoes from a place that no longer existed. So I decided to nurture another narrative, that of someone who understands the impact of God's love, someone who recognizes the power in rising after a fall. And it was curious to see how this new perspective began to be reflected in my choices as well. Small decisions, once driven by fear, were now guided by trust. I no longer accepted anything just to fill a void, because I understood that it wasn't a void to be filled by someone else, but a space for transformation that was being shaped by the Creator Himself. What I had previously seen as loss, I now saw as part of a journey. Behind the scenes of my pain, God was writing revelations that I could only understand after I accepted a new position. This process also brought a powerful liberation. I realized I didn't need to prove anything to anyone. I didn't have to justify myself, nor seek recognition from human hands. My identity was secure in a place no one could touch. It was then that I understood the true meaning of being sustained. Sustained not just in the sense of being supported, but of having a firm foundation, something that kept me standing when everything seemed unstable. This certainty gave me the courage to face my memories without fear, to look at my scars without them imprisoning me, to transform what was a source of shame into a testament to victory. And as this awareness grew, a new kind of freedom emerged. It wasn't about forgetting what happened, but about no longer being held hostage by it. It wasn't about denying the pain, but about letting it fulfill its role of teaching me. It was about making space within myself so that faith, not resentment, was the driving force. This shift in perspective showed me that the most important decisions in life are not those we make in moments of plenitude, but those we choose amidst chaos. Because it is there, in the contrast of pain, that our true identity can be revealed. This repositioning was not just a response to what I'd experienced, but a preparation for what was yet to come. It was as if God was showing me that every detail of my story, even the most difficult parts, could be used as seeds for something greater. And within this new vision, I began to realize that the pieces that previously seemed disconnected were actually forming a mosaic that could only be understood with time. The impact of this understanding was so profound that it gave me the strength to continue walking, no longer as someone lost in the shadows, but as someone who finally understood who I was and where my strength came from. And it is precisely at this point that the journey takes on a new meaning, because when you understand who you are and who you belong to, everything around you begins to align in an unexpected way. Today, when I look at myself, I no longer find the old identity I once tried to carry like an inevitable label. That mark of betrayed, which so often weighed on my shoulders and made me believe it was all that was left of me, has lost its power. It has been replaced by something much greater, by an awareness that only emerged when I accepted to delve deeply into the process of healing and transformation. Now, the word that defines me is restored. And this restoration doesn't mean erasing history, but resignifying each part of it, understanding that even the broken fragments can fit together into a work far greater than I imagined. There's a powerful revelation in this process. Identity isn't what others place upon us, but what we choose to embrace in the face of truth. And the truth I've found is that I'm not the product of someone else's mistake, nor of injustice, nor of abandonment. I'm the result of grace, of the opportunity to start over, of the mindset that chooses to see beyond the wound. It's as if life has shown me, behind the scenes of pain, that there's always a hidden path to reconstruction, even when everything seems in ruins. This shift in identity also had a direct impact on my decisions. Before, I walked around trying to prove my worth, conforming to expectations, afraid of not being accepted. Today, what guides my heart is not the need for recognition, but the certainty that I am already enough. This changes everything. It changes the way we relate, the way we react to loss, even the way we dream. Because when you know you're restored, you're no longer afraid to start over, to take risks, to believe again. And it's curious how this internal transformation also alters the way we see the world around us. What once seemed like a threat now becomes an opportunity. What once seemed like an end is now a revelation. What was pain is now a testimony. This shift in mindset shows us that true strength lies not in never falling, but in allowing each fall to teach us something new about who we are and what we carry within. It was during this repositioning that I realized something even more profound. Restoration isn't just about returning to who you were before, but about becoming someone even more whole, more aware, and more prepared for the impact of the journey. It's not about returning to the starting point, but about moving toward a destination that could only be reached after overcoming everything that seemed impossible. It's in this place that identity ceases to be a wound and becomes a victory. And it is precisely in this state of consciousness that life begins to take on a different shine. Because pain no longer has the power to define who you are, it simply becomes part of the story that reveals who you can be. I had to go through dark valleys to understand that pain doesn't diminish anyone. It only reveals dimensions that were previously hidden. That's why today, as I look at you, listening attentively, I say with absolute certainty, you are not less because of the pain you suffered. On the contrary, there is a hidden strength within, waiting to be awakened. We often believe that being hurt is synonymous with weakness, when in fact, it is in these tears that the courage to continue is born. The wound doesn't define who you are, but it can become living proof of your ability to endure. When we understand this, our mindset changes completely. We no longer carry rejection or betrayal as chains, but as marks of a history that is being redefined. You may have been hurt, but that doesn't make you broken forever. The truth is that within every pain lies a revelation, and when that revelation comes, it changes not only how we view the past, but also how we face the future. It's as if every decision from now on carries a new weight, not of fear, but of awareness. I know it's often hard to believe this when the tears still fall, when the memory still hurts, when the impact of others' choices still reverberates within you. But I want you to realize your identity hasn't been stolen, just obscured by what you've experienced. And when you decide to lift that veil, what emerges isn't someone lesser, but someone stronger, more aware, more capable of charting a new path. It's not easy, I know. Transformation doesn't happen overnight, but begins the moment you choose not to limit yourself to pain. This is the turning point, when you discover you no longer need to live imprisoned by a label. There's something greater waiting. For you, a restored life, a story with purpose, an identity that can't be erased by circumstances. And perhaps that is the most liberating truth of all. Even after everything, you are still enough. I learned that placing my faith in people is like building a house on sand. The first gust of wind sweeps it all away. For a long time, I placed my expectations in human hands, believing that from there would come security, stability, and even salvation. But life, with its unexpected revelations, revealed the hidden truth. No one can sustain what they were not called to carry. And when that ground crumbled, I realized there was a deeper foundation waiting to be discovered. It was at that point that my faith repositioned itself, ceasing to be fragile and circumstantial, to become something solid, planted in the one who never abandons me. It's not that people aren't important, but I understood that they are not the source. The impact of this decision changed my mindset, transformed the way I walk, and even the choices I make. Today, I no longer seek in others what only the Creator can offer me. This transformation didn't distance me from the world. On the contrary, it gave me clarity to live in it with greater lightness and truth, knowing that there is an invisible sustenance that doesn't depend on human failings, but on a God who remains. If there's one thing I learned on that journey, it's that no pain defines the end of a story. Being betrayed, abandoned, or silenced may seem, at first, like a cruel sentence, as if life had been ripped from your hands. But the truth is, there's a space between the fall and the rebuilding that reveals a strength you might never have realized before. It's in this space that mindsets shift, perspectives transform, and hope begins to blossom in a new way. There's a powerful revelation hidden in the scars we bear. They're not signs of weakness, but testimonies of survival. Each tear can become fuel for a new phase. Each conscious decision opens doors to new beginnings that once seemed impossible. And as contradictory as it may sound, it's precisely in the impact of loss that the greatest discoveries about who we are and how capable we are of reinventing ourselves are often born. If you feel extinguished today, remember, there's still a flame within you. The journey isn't over, and the purpose remains alive, just waiting to be embraced with courage. And perhaps the greatest revelation in all of this is understanding that sharing one story isn't just about exposing wounds, but about transforming scars into pathways for others. When we open our hearts and allow the hidden truth of what we've experienced to find a voice, something powerful happens. Other women, who often believe they're alone in their pain, discover that there is hope, that the journey of overcoming is real and possible. Every word spoken carries impact. Every testimony can be the key someone needed to make a new decision, change their mindset, and see life through new eyes. It's in this movement of vulnerability that strength multiplies, that pain becomes a legacy, and that love manifests itself in the form of encouragement. And if this story resonated within you, if it somehow brought clarity, courage, or comfort, then it's time to be part of this movement that not only inspires, but also sustains.